welcome our special guest tonight, Dr. Robin Wall Kimmerer, and we're so excited to have you here for our masterclass on, well, several topics, I think. We'll be talking about personal essay writing, environmental writing, how to blend those two things together, and of course, our very beloved book, Braiding Sweetgrass. So thank you so much for joining us tonight. I'd love for you to just tell us a little bit about yourself, about your background, and about your book to kick us off tonight.
I'd love to. Thank you, Jillian. I'd like to just begin as a Three Fires Confederacy person myself, as a Potawatomi, say bonjour and dinaway maganado, hello all my relatives. Shabadas ke gish kokwe nadeshnakas, bodwe watmi kwenda, megaze dodem minwa makododem. Miigwech kinagego gamishang. I'm so grateful to be here with you. I've told you that I'm an Anishinaabe Potawatomi woman of the Bear Clan and also of the Eagles. I'm speaking to you tonight from the ancestral and contemporary territories of the Onondaga Nation here in upstate New York. And I love talking to students. I love talking to student readers. As a writer, there's really nothing more rewarding than talking to folks about writing and about reading, of course, but to try to understand how our words land, how they do, where they do, and what connects and what doesn't. So I'm really going to be looking forward to our conversation, Jillian, and to questions from the students as well.
Yeah. So your book, Braiding Sweetgrass, that's sort of the part of the reason why we're here tonight. Tell us a little bit about the book and how it came to be. It's been out for a couple of years now, but it's something that just really resonates, I think, with so many people across so many ages and demographics and around our entire country.
It's been a great surprise to me. The book has been out since 2013. What I'm told is the way that it's spreading is the way that sweetgrass spreads. Sweetgrass isn't a cedar, it's not like our beautiful dandelions that spread seeds everywhere. It spreads underground with a rhizome, and it spreads by people digging it up and bringing it with them and planting it around them because they love having it. And what I'm told by the publisher is that that's how the book is moving, is that people say, I read this book and I think you'll like it too. I think you'll want this near you. And so they're passing it as transplants. That speaks to a real longing that I think we have for reconnection with the living world and for a reconnection with Indigenous knowledge. So I'm terribly excited about what I feel like is the work that book is doing in the world of beginning to heal our relationship with land.
Yeah, absolutely. So for you, what comes first when you're writing, whether it's an essay or, your books? Is it, your passion for science and nature, or is it your passion for the written word? And which inspires you most as you sit down and put pen to paper or fingers to keyboard?
That's a really great question. And I have a super hard time separating those because the place that I get most of my ideas for writing is from the natural world. There'll be a story that I'm perceiving in the natural world, and I'll think like, oh yes, I have to write about that. And immediately the images and the words will start to come. So they're inseparable, really.
That makes perfect sense. And when you were younger, I mean, did you think that you would grow up to be a writer, to be a botanist, to be a scientist? Or did this come just as a great adventure, or were there some formative moments, when you were younger, where you were like, this is the path I want to take, this is where I know I want to go?
The answer is for most of us, yes and no. For me, the pathway was always green. It was always a plant pathway. People ask me, when did you first get interested in plants? And since I was born, it's just how I see the world. And so I knew I would be a botanist, but students will, I hope, appreciate this. When it came time for me to go to college, I had to decide whether I wanted to study poetry or whether I wanted to do botany. Clearly botany won out, but again, it was that love of language and that love of metaphor that I thought, oh, I just want to write like that. But it seemed a good deal more practical to become a botanist. And so that's what I did. But I couldn't be happier that those paths have converged again.
Yeah.
But when I think about that, I always loved language. My mother reminds me that I published my first book when I was 8 years old because I was writing all these little poems about the natural world, and she very kindly stitched them together into a little handmade book for me.
Oh, that's
So
a good mom right there.
yeah, it's so sweet. So that's a way for me of remembering that those two loves have always been fused. But I never honestly would have predicted that I became a scientist. I didn't think that language and plants necessarily would come into the world of science. I thought more I would probably be doing more activism and land stewardship and so forth. But my great desire to teach kind of led me into the university world. I love doing research, no question, but it's really the teaching that inspires me.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you find yourself reading books of poetry? I mean, now that you've said that and knowing that there was this poet in you all along, I see it in your writing. Do you touch on that, daily in your life, or do you have any recommendations of great poets for us to check out as readers?
Oh, a poet who comes to mind that I think would be perfect in your community. Do you know Ross Gay's work
I
at all?
don't. No.
Oh my goodness, he's a wonderful, wonderful poet. And the book of his that I cherish I cherish it so much I can't exactly remember the name of it.
Always what happens on Zoom.
Right. It's something like the Encyclopedia of Delights.
Oh, I love that. Even if that's
Um,
not the title, it should be.
it's something about the collection of delights. And he wrote every single day about something that delighted him in that day. Um, and so it has the resonance of paying attention to the world in such a way that you're inevitably going to be delighted. Um, and it has the work of gratitude built into that, because when you do feel delighted by the smallest thing in the world, and sometimes big things, you can't help but cultivate that attitude of thankfulness.
Absolutely. Yeah, something we would certainly need now, I think, more than ever. And something you just said, I mean, it really sparked a question for me, that he was observing his world, he was connected to the world. When you think about writing, I mean, do you have a special spot you go and sit maybe, or are you out taking a walk and an idea comes to you? How does, your writing style spark? What is the seed that usually starts you off on a writing journey for an essay or a full book?
Yeah. For me, it's almost always built around an image that seems so multi-layered that I want to explore it. Writing for me is a learning process. That idea that, as students especially, we're often given, people say, well, write what you know. I write to find out what I know. It always is an exploration process. So for me, it's it's noticing something that I'm deeply curious about, often in the living world, not always, but that seems to have a story underneath it that is not yet seen, not yet fully formed, and I want to go investigate that story. For me, it's also increasingly tied up in words. I'm studying our language, Anishinaabemowin, I'm just a beginner, but there are certain words that for me open that door to multi-layeredness, that like, oh, why are when buds open. When I learned the word for opening buds, I thought, wait a second, I've heard that word before. Isn't that the word for love, or do I have something mixed up? No, I did not have something mixed up. That the root word for love and the root word for a bud opening are the same. Like, phew.
That gave me chills.
Right. Those are the moments when I run for my desk.
Yeah,
Like, oh,
absolutely.
I have to think about this. I have to, in what ways are buds opening love?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. I love that. So you're sitting down at your desk. Are you an outliner, or do you just sort of let the creativity flow and come back and fill in the gaps later as you go?
Yeah, no, I'm not an outliner. Sometimes I have to, but I think for the really good writing, for me, doesn't happen that way. It just happens I'm a big believer in free writing, and just letting it happen. And I always write by hand. And I only go to the laptop much later, really, for revising, because then you have a map of all of your ideas. You have your map of your dead ends. You have the map of these ideas that seemed brilliant in the moment, and then you go back and it's like, yeah, not so much. But it's all there. So I treasure that process. But for me, I just let it happen, and try to get out of my own way, quite honestly.
Yeah. What is your editing process like? I mean, once you go back and you know where those dead ends are, where the road is leading you, do you come at it with a big red pen, or do you sort of sit and think on it? Do you have people maybe that you bounce early drafts off of that you found really can give you great feedback as you start to narrow in and revise?
It's a great question. I don't, in early stages, use reader feedback very much.
Mhm.
I think that's such a vulnerable stage of writing, and I feel like if I shared it with somebody, then I'm accountable. I have to do that, and I'd rather stay flexible about it. But for me, once I have things on the page, I then have to start structuring it. I know what the heart of the essay is going to be, and then I have to figure out a way to lead my reader to that. Because when I'm reading, I don't really so much like being told.
Mhm.
Um, I want to feel as if I'm discovering something. And so to me, that's the real craft, is to say, I know what the heart of this labyrinth is, and how am I going to lead you there, so that when you get there, you'll say, oh my goodness, I get it.
Yeah.
So it's that structuring um, that is the big part of the revising process for me.
Yeah, I think that's so important. I mean, I know from my school days, so many essays are written, make an argument, make a point, put it in your thesis at the very beginning and go from there. Oh, and I've just got a kitty cat, so sorry if anybody starts to hear meows coming through. I thought I had the door shut, but they're very smart. But I think, you start off learning to argue almost in a way. And I think what, maybe the next evolution is learning how to share more than to argue. And I think that's what I've loved, reading your book. Is I feel like you're telling me a story and you're taking me with you on a journey. You're not pushing me down along a path, but you're helping me get there on my own. And when you're writing like that, how do you feel? You have to follow a thread and you have to have a light for your readers. And how do you pull people, especially, somebody like me, not a botanist, not a scientist, along in, especially, the art of nature writing, because and environmental writing, sometimes it could probably feel, difficult for somebody, a layman, to jump in and not know anything about, botany or about science, but you bring us with you. And how do you connect, that voice and that message to somebody who may be on the outside? How do you bring us in?
Yeah. I often draw on my experience as a teacher in that regard. And especially, I teach a lot on the land as best I can, and I teach in the field. And so sometimes, not always, but sometimes I'm very conscious of it being a field trip, that you have to gather up, and be sure that you have your water and your snacks and your bug dope. You have to feel safe before you can go someplace else. And because a lot of the things that I write about cross cultural boundaries, boundaries of knowledge and worldview, to say nothing of a deep dive into science, they're places that many people feel uncomfortable. And so I usually try to meet my reader where I think they are, not where I am, but where they are. And then, walk beside you, take you by the hand for a little while, and then bring you to a place that you never expected to go. So it's admittedly a little subversive, but intentionally so, because think of it, there's so many times that we read things where you really don't want to go beyond the first page. Like, I don't get this. This doesn't relate to me. Why would I want to know this? I want to try to address that in the very beginning and build this sense of trust with the reader so that we can go look at things together.
Yeah, well, and I feel that as I read along kind of with your words, you put a lot of yourself into your writing. You have stories of your own life, of your family's life, of, your culture. And how would you recommend, for a young person writing, whether it's a school essay, a college essay, how do you recommend bringing yourself into a piece in a natural and engaging way that doesn't feel, like you're saying, but you really, you embrace your reader in a certain way. And that's such a wonderful thing to do.
I don't know that I've really thought that through, but there's a way in which avoiding the because you don't want to read that. And I don't want to write it. There is, in Anishinaabe teachings, we talk about the 7 grandfather teachings, and one of those teachings is Edbasendo and the virtue of humility. And so I feel very comfortable in that place of saying to my reader, I've never seen this before, or I don't know how to think about this, or I didn't know how to think about this until this happened, or this happened. So that to me sets a stage for other people to engage, because we've all experienced confusion or something that we thought was true turned out not to be. So coming at it from always as the place of the learner rather than as the deliverer of knowledge is for me a very natural stance, and I think it's inviting for readers to it invites you to come along and think about what you know and what you've experienced as well.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think that connection, I mean, you bring that personal voice to a piece. And I know that's something I know I struggled with when I was a writer. I would just, in school, I would just say, okay, here are the facts, here's the information. And it was missing a voice. How did you develop yours? Were there bumps along the way where you're like, what do I sound like when I write? Because to me, it's warm, it's soothing, but there's action almost to it as well. How did you kind of pull together that voice and put it out into the world?
It's interesting that you use the word, listen. I do read aloud to myself a lot. That's one of my editing techniques, is that I not only want the ideas to flow and to have energy, but it's so important to me the way something sounds. So I do read out loud a lot. And for me, that's a really good editing technique, because I can say, no one would ever say that. X, X, X. And then you find another way, and a a less direct way. Although sometimes you have to be direct. And I very much like that change of pace. Like in a stream, you're going along on, I like to paddle, going along on flat water, but then you need some riffles and a big old rock there to get your attention. And I love doing that in writing. So having sequencing and pacing that helps people move along, and you could have very gentle kinds of language, and then you run into a rock of some really hard stuff. But you're willing to look at that hard stuff because you've just been in flat water. You know what I mean?
I do, absolutely. And I love that you use that metaphor. I think, it really is, reading it can be smooth sailing, it can be rocky, but the journey that you take is so important, and every page and every chapter prepares you for what's coming next. And even as you described that, I mean, that harkens back to what you said about maybe becoming a poet. And, when you're writing, it felt to me almost every sentence had a poetic quality to it. Like it makes sense now to hear that you read the book out loud, word by word. They're so perfectly chosen and carefully chosen. How much of that, naturally flows? How much of that for you is going back and being, is this the right word? Is this the right phrasing? How much do you kind of spend on that and maybe agonize over it a little bit? And how much of it just flows naturally as you write?
I don't agonize over it very much. It just comes out that way. To me, it's a reflection of the living world, which is orderly and poetic and beautiful. So as somebody who has really devoted my whole life to listening to the natural world, it doesn't really surprise me. So no, I don't think I really belabor it. But some of that also comes from the fact that I'm also a scientist, and I'm thinking about the students listening in particular. I mean, essay writing in the way that Braiding Sweetgrass is composed is, of course, a very different thing than writing a research paper to be published in an academic journal. They're very, very different. But one of the things they have in common is disciplined language. In scientific writing, I was just grading term papers this afternoon. When my students would say, well, this is they kept saying this is great or this is incredible. And I'm thinking, no, let's have a specific word. What is it? It's really effective. It's influential. It's what? It can't just be great. And scientific writing demands specificity, and that word means what it means and nothing else. And so in a way, my scientific writing feeds my lyrical writing because I'm already have that discipline of saying there's a right word for this, and I'm going to wait for it to come. And sometimes for me also, it is a phrase that will give birth to an essay. Like the phrase is just so perfect that when it sounds right to me, I know that it's carrying gravity. There's gravity to it. So
yeah,
again,
absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, and I think, I mean, that phrasing and the gravity, I mean, even Braiding Sweetgrass, I just very quickly, I wanted to read just a little bit from the very beginning, just in the preface. And so forgive me, I'll do the reading here real quick. But talking about how braiding sweetgrass actually works. And you say, of course, you can do it by yourself by tying it into a chair or by holding it in your teeth and braiding backward away from yourself. But the sweetest way is to have someone else hold the end so that you pull gently against each other, all the while leaning in, head to head, chatting and laughing, watching each other's hands, one holding steady while the other shifts the slim bundles over one another, each in its turn. Linked by sweetgrass, there is a reciprocity between you. Linked by sweetgrass, the holder is as vital as the braider. And I just, even that, I mean, the way that this book came together, it seems, I mean, you really did just link everything together. You linked your reader to you. You linked, the different sections of the book together. All of it is so well thought out and so encompassing and so connective. And, when you're writing, I mean, do you think of start point and end point all at once and pull it together that way? Or do you think, if I start here, maybe I'll end up here, and you can find 7 different paths that you might go along the way, and maybe to your science background too. Do you start with a theory here, thinking this is where your endpoint will be, and you find all these new questions and answers along your way, and writing and science together? How does that journey feel to you? And what are some of maybe those favorite moments of Eureka along the way that you get?
Yeah. Speaking to braiding sweetgrass in particular, and I do have my braid of sweetgrass here, always is my guide, is in writing braiding sweetgrass, I did know where I was beginning and I did know where I was ending. But like science, and I'm glad you brought this up, it's really a good point, Jillian. It is very akin to having a hypothesis or a theory. And I know what the work of that theory in the world is, but then there's the critical piece of evidence. You can't just think things up. You have to have, well, you can, but you need to have evidence. It's fine for me to say the world works by reciprocity and we all need to do that. Great. But I need to give you evidence. What is reciprocity? What does it look like in everyday life? What's reciprocity with your family? What does reciprocity with your neighbors look like? What does reciprocity look like in an economy? So I was pretty intentional of trying to amass different kinds of evidence so that by the time the reader got to the end, they would say, yeah, this is the way the world works, or this is the way the world that I want to live in.
Yeah.
And you've gotten some ideas about how you might practice it.
Absolutely. And is that maybe there's, again, another part of the book, where you ask your students, what has nature done for humans? What have humans done for nature? And, with your writing, is that one of the goals you set out to prove of what humans now can do for nature and maybe overcome what we have done to it?
Precisely. Right. Because we have been, ever since the Enlightenment, ever since Descartes, let's say, we have this notion of separation of humans and nature, which is so at the heart of the Western worldview and so opposite to the Indigenous worldview. So yes, that was very intentional to say, I know this is where you are right now, but let's have an act of collective imagination to see if we could see ourselves differently as givers to the natural world, not just consumers. And there are a lot of powerful forces out there that want us to be nothing more than consumers, right?
Yes.
But we aren't. And the other thing that I wanted to do is that all of us tend to assume in a strange way that the way things are is the way they always have been. And that we've always had this relationship with nature, or that competition is always going to structure the world. Well, that's really a worldview that has been present for about the last 500 years. But we've been on the planet for a great deal longer than 500 years. 500 years is like an eye blink in history. And yet we tend to assume, well, that's just the way it is. That's just the way people are. And looking at Indigenous ways of being, you have to say, no, there are other ways that we have lived on this planet in a whole, beautiful, sustainable way for a lot longer than 500 years.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and I think when you pull in, the culture and the history into your writing, it gives people maybe new outlooks that they hadn't had before, new history that they didn't know before, new truths that they'd never thought of. And I'd love to know, as a writer, when you're thinking about introducing something new, a new topic, a new story, anything like that to an audience, where do you start? I mean, we talked earlier about, meeting people where they are, and, how much of your time do you spend thinking about the reader, your end reader, and how much time do you think about your message and, maybe where those two meet?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they have to meet if it's going to work, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I know there are a number of writers who I really respect who say they don't write for an audience. They write for the story or for what they need to say. And I'm clearly driven by a message as well. But truthfully, I am always thinking about my audience because I want them to come with me. And there's an extent to which it works really well if you provide multiple entry points for people. When I think about why Braiding Sweetgrass has been so widely read, I think it's because there are a lot of entry points. You might not be remotely interested in botany or Indigenous knowledge, but I wrote a lot about being a mother and being a daughter. We all have relationships with mothers, right?
Yes.
And for a while I thought, oh, should I even put this in? I thought, well, yeah, this is part of the story. And it turns out that that's a very powerful doorway for many people to think about mothering. What does it mean to be a good ancestor? Uh, I write quite openly about the spiritual nature of my own thinking and writing, and it turns out that one of the big readerships for the book is in people in faith communities of all sorts, because there is a doorway to thinking about the unseen forces at work in the world. So I think the more pathways you can build in, again, create an invitation to people to engage with something that they ordinarily would not.
And that feels like such good advice. I mean, I'm sure there are some students listening tonight that are thinking about college essays. And a lot of times, there's that personal essay of either why do you want to go to this school, or what do you want to study, or tell us something about you. I know mine was always the tell us something you've overcome, that type of a piece. And I love the idea of finding multiple entry points along that journey. Your essay probably has to have still, a thesis and still follow a structure, but having different ways to connect people together as they're reading about you or reading, whatever your piece might be, can be so powerful. And you'll find people along the way that you probably never expected to, kind of as you were saying. So we're getting here. I'll just make a quick note. We're getting to our almost our Q&A time. So feel free. I know a few people have popped questions in there, but let's do a little hands-on. I mean, what are some of your favorite advice tips for writers, especially young and aspiring writers, things that maybe helped you along your path as you set out on the writing portion of your journey?
Yeah. Well, of course, the answer is it depends on what kind of writing you're doing. But I really believe, as I said earlier, in free writing. I try to start any project with free writing. And oftentimes that just kind of brain dump for 10 minutes of writing whatever's on my mind, sometimes it leads to something I need to say in the work that needs to be done that day. Sometimes it doesn't, but what it does is to make me pay attention to what's on my mind, and sometimes to say, well, that's going to really be distracting. So I'm going to deal with it on the page right now so that then I can go write this more disciplined essay. So free writing is to me really helpful. It's like doing stretches before a workout. It's really, really helpful. The other thing for me is that I don't know about you guys as writers, but starting is the hardest part, right? And free writing helps you remember that you can throw the beginning away. You just pitch it. It's just warm up. So don't start that way, and then if you throw it away, you do. But the where to start thing, for me, as a person who has to write a lot, the environment is really important to me. When I need to get really serious work done, um, I go to a place. It has the smell of that candle. It has the right pens and paper. It's just like this little cocoon that says, okay, now it's time to write, as opposed to doing it at the kitchen table or something like that. There's plenty of good kitchen table writing, but I think it's really good to create yourself a space that is devoted to letting your interior thoughts come out onto the page, and it can be like a trigger to help those thoughts come through, because you know what your purpose is in that place.
So you're definitely a place writer. Are you a time writer? Do you set aside time every day to write? I mean, you're probably busy between speaking engagements and classes and wanting to be outside and do your work. So how do you find time to write? And are you the type of person that is like, from 6 a.m. to 8 a.m. every day I write no matter what comes out? Or do you seek the inspiration to write and go from there?
When I am working on something that I know what is, I can be very disciplined about it and say, these are my 2 hours, I'm working on this. That's when I know what I'm writing. But when I don't know, when it's still in the exploratory, fermenting kind of stage, I don't set aside time. It's just constantly fermenting. And then something starts to coalesce, and then I can work on it. But I consider that time writing time too. I think I tell this story in the book of, I used to stay home from campus one day a week just to write. And my dear friend and neighbor, the farm across the road from me, knows this. And so one afternoon I was out planting daffodil bulbs, and she yells across the road, "That doesn't look like writing to me." She caught me. But in fact, it is writing, because I had been at my desk all morning, and many scientists of creativity tell you that you can work for an intense period of several hours, and then you need to go do something physical and mindless. And it is while you're doing that physical, mindless thing that the really good ideas come. And to me, that's absolutely true.
Love that. So yeah, so we should all start gardens, and that can be our moment out, and to be outside too. I mean, you probably just draw a lot of inspiration just the moment you step outside, the smells, the sounds, the feelings, and no matter what you're writing, even if you're writing an English paper on a book from the 1500s, there's probably something to be said for taking a walk, being out in nature, and letting the world around you really inspire you.
Absolutely. Well said. Yep.
Yeah. Yeah, well, here, I just actually just saw a question pop up in here. Oh, I love this question. So we have somebody asking, how many times do you normally revise a piece of your writing? And what do you recommend to help keeping yourself from getting bored of your own writing during the revision process?
Yeah, that can happen. um, uh, what I try very hard to do is to kind of divide it into phases. Again, that's for me key of writing longhand, because I can't edit myself while I'm writing longhand. When you're working on the laptop, you're writing a sentence, you're like, well, no, not that. And you spend all this time crafting a single sentence, and that's as far as you got.
Yeah.
And I try to avoid that self-editing in the beginning, in order to just let the flow happen. And so then the editing becomes, then revising just becomes more of a craft, of being sure that it's like a puzzle, that those pieces fit, and when they fit. And that's how I avoid getting bored with my own writing. I say, they fit, done, end of story. I try not to mess with it too much after that. Yeah.
Yeah. No, I know the feeling, as I'm a children's book writer with Sesame Street. And so I know the feeling of typing out, especially when you're rhyming. Is that the perfect rhyming word? And you can read the cadence of it 1,000 times over and over in your head. And you really can get to the point of, I don't want to look at this anymore. And so I love that idea of not over editing. I mean, editing to the point where, you don't have typos. It's saying what you want it to say in the right way, but I think it maybe takes away the joy sometimes, if you are thinking too critically about writing. Writing is joy and is about joy, even if you're writing something serious or something, more academic. There's joy there, there's knowledge, there's expression. And I think capturing that is so important. It leads me to a question I meant to ask you earlier. I think everybody tuning in tonight is a writer, an aspiring writer, somebody who loves to read and write, but what advice do you have when you're in a writing slump? If you have some writer's block, or you're just not feeling inspired, and either you have to write something, you have an essay due, or it's a terrible feeling, isn't it?
It is.
But what do you do? Do you have any tips or secrets, or is it just you gotta wait and work through it?
When I have something I have to write, and that is almost always the time when I don't wanna,
Yeah.
I don't wanna, and it's terrible. That's when I become very mechanical. That's when I use an outline. Say, well, this isn't flowing, so let me build it instead.
Mhm.
And usually as I build it, good things happen. It just provides a structure for the flow when it happens. But that's when I go to an outline. I need an opening image that will draw the reader to consider this conflict. Okay, what could that be? It's boring, it's mechanical, but it can get me over the hump.
Yeah. Oh, I like that. And I think sometimes, I mean, we think of writing as craft, and sometimes craft doesn't just mean art. Craft means mechanics, and putting those two together. It can be challenging sometimes, but sometimes one begets the other, and you find yourself working on something you thought would be boring or difficult, and you find that you can enjoy it along the way. There's a lovely question here. Do book ideas come easily to you, or does it take a lot of time to come up with something? So, how do you get to the idea? If it doesn't fully spark your attention, do you throw it away then, or do you just maybe put it in a drawer and wait for the right moment of it? How do you, I'm sure you've got a million ideas in your head at any moment. How do you navigate all of them?
Yeah, I want to answer that by showing you my bookshelf full of composition books. I mean, I just write, that's my favorite. I write on those little composition books. So it's all there. And I have more ideas than lifetimes. Yeah. So I'm constantly writing things. Oh, I want to do that. I want to do that. And that too can be paralyzing, like when there's so many. Well, which am I going to do? So I would advise you, if you're keeping a notebook of all the ideas that you want to write about, be smarter than I am and find a way to index them. And that, I suppose, is really the digital realm, because I do all of this longhand. I am often in the case of like, I remember that great metaphor. I was on a plane and I wrote it down in a green notebook. And then I spend hours trying to find what was that one good idea. The digital world can search, find. You can't, it's hard to do that with many notebooks. But the notion of keeping a little notebook in your back pocket is, I think, really, really important, because you never know when just the right phrase or word or image is going to come to you. And it can be like a little seed that grows into a whole book, just this one little thing. So don't let them slip away.
Yeah. So say you've grasped that seed, you found it. What do you do if you're afraid of what people will think of your writing? What do you do if you're afraid of a topic, that's, you want to explore it, you want to write about it, you're not sure if you're the right person, or if you'll do it right, or maybe you're a new writer just starting out and you build some confidence off of that. How would you, advise somebody in that situation?
Mm, this will be advice to myself, because there are plenty of those situations for me when I think, am I the right person to tell this story? Do I know enough about it to tell the story? The thing that helped me with that immeasurably, because remember, I made a transition from really writing scientific articles to writing Gathering Moss and Braiding Sweetgrass. And I had to let go of a lot of that structure and fear that says, well, you can't say that. It was a lot of work to get to a place to say, oh, yes, I can. What helped me is I remember reading a quote from another writer who said when she was afraid and not very confident, she said, I don't have to write this knowing that it's absolutely true. I know that in this moment, it's true for me, and therefore it is worthy of the page. And that's a position of humility as well, to say you don't have to be an authority. You just say what's true for you. What's true for you. And it doesn't have to be, universally true, chiseled into tablets. It's true for you. And that's what stories are. So that confidence grows. It sure doesn't go away. I experience it myself many times, like, can I do this? But let me also tell you that I think the very best things that I've written have come from that place of uncertainty, thinking, I don't know about this. This is people will say, what, she can't do that. But when I say to myself, well, yes, I can. This is what I want to say. And it doesn't mean that I'm going to say it to the whole world, but I'm going to say it to the page. And then you might be surprised. Let me tell you one other secret. When I was beginning this transition from only doing science writing, where I had a reputation of, I'm a scientist who does this, and now I'm going to write something really different. Of course, I was petrified by what my peers would think. And a dear friend said, well, just adopt a pseudonym and put on that hat of the pseudonym when you're writing this, and you could pretend that you're never going to publish it under your real name. And that's super liberating.
Absolutely. I love that. I feel like I don't know who I would be, but I need to think of that. If I would even take on the persona of another author that I love.
Yeah.
And somebody actually asked, who are some of the authors that have inspired you along the way? I know we talked about some poetry earlier, but other environmental writers or novelists, or even scientific journals that we should go and check out. Who gave you sparks along the way and made you want to write in that vein, or be in that type of field?
Yeah. For me, the earliest example that I'm really aware of that I would call the kind of writing that I do, which is based in science, but also based in story and philosophy, are the essays of Lauren Eisley, who was, excuse me, greatly revered during his time, but people don't read him so much anymore. But he was a scientist and a poet, and he brought those things together on the page and led you to that place that I believe in so much of, to say that sometimes just a fact of the world can be a poem. And so I think I was reading him, when I was early in college, maybe. And so that was always a kind of a voice in my ear of a kind of science writing that I adored, in a way that I didn't find standard scientific writing to touch me in any way. It was intellectually fascinating, but it didn't move me the way his writing did.
Yeah, that's a great example. I've got to look up some essays there. I mean, I love your work, so I must love his too. This is a wonderful question that just came in. I wonder what, if anything, you learned about the world, your culture, or about writing through the writing of your book. And maybe each of those pieces about the natural world, about your culture, and about your gift as a writer. What were some of those moments of, wow, I didn't know this. You mentioned the word for a bud opening, things like that. What were some of those moments that felt really special to you along that journey?
I think that a very special part of this journey for me has been learning my language, because in that metaphorical braid of sweetgrass of Indigenous knowledge and Western thinking that I have been living and navigating, right, my whole life, and wanted to kind of meditate on in the book. Learning a little bit of Anishinaabemowin and the worldview that comes with it gave me confidence in my own voice, because when you look at the one example that I write a lot about is that beautiful word papoi, about a word that describes how a mushroom pushes up out of the ground overnight, and all of the thinking about the animacy of the world that followed from that. It made me feel as if I wasn't alone in writing about the personhood of the world. I felt as if my whole culture stood behind me in writing about that. So it gave me confidence in a way that this was something that I really needed to share. So
Yeah.
I'm so grateful to all of the language revitalization workers, language warriors, as we think about them, who are doing that magnificent work, because it's so much more than just language. It's a whole nother way to look at the world, and it has been very good medicine for me.
I love that. So we have a few questions in here. I'm just scrolling through. I like this one, thinking about the medicine and maybe a different kind, nature as medicine. But if you find something in nature you want to write about, do you take photos to remember the feeling you had while looking at it, or otherwise capture a special moment that you have while you're out to then turn it into writing later on?
I take lots of pictures, but usually not for that purpose. But again, because this is the realm that I live in, I have a very good internal camera, if you know what I mean. And that's one of the things that I love about writing. I didn't perhaps remember how much was in that internal photograph. And writing is an opportunity to revisit those places and those senses, and not only the physical world, but how I felt about it and who I was with, and it all comes flowing back. So if a actual visual image works for you, do it. For me, it's a more of a gestalt kind of internal image, not only of the photograph, but of the situation. But cultivate that ability to take those memory photographs as well.
Yeah. And we've got another writer coming in here. Do you actively look for these kinds of moments and these ideas, or do you wait for them to come to you? Do you wait for a situation that you're in to give you that spark, or do you go out on a walk and say, I want to find something new today, something different I've never seen before? And maybe it's both. Maybe it's both for those.
That's a really great question. And I bet every one of us will answer that differently. For me, I don't go looking. Um, um, oh, sorry if you can hear that. No one is being, um, you know, murdered outside my window. My neighbor has peacocks, and this time of night they decide they need to shriek. And I know it sounds pretty weird. Where was I? I don't go looking because, in fact, for me, and this may not be the truth for you at all, but for me, going looking is a surefire way not to find it. You know, it's like that old expression of that you see best out of the corner of your eye.
Mhm.
Um, what I get in my own way if I go looking for something. If I said I'm going to go look out there and look for a metaphor, I think it's going to be a really boring one. Whereas if I'm planting daffodil bulbs and I see something in the grass, it's like, boom, there it is. It's a matter of always just being waiting, being open. I think that's what it is. You have to be open, open to the messages of the world. A dear friend of mine, a Mohawk scholar, was writing about the Mohawk understanding of imagination. And he said, in the Western world, we think about imagination as if it's something sort of fantastical, it's not real, and it's locked inside our heads. It's our own little fantasy is what imagination is, right? But he said in the Mohawk way, imagination is actually the consciousness of all beings. And it's all out there vibrating and happening. And when you imagine something, you just have like a little thread coming down from everything that is. And for me, that's a very good descriptor of the way the world is. I get ideas when somehow a little thread reaches out between me and the world, and it becomes a little conduit for something that needs to be said.
That's beautiful. I wish we all thought of imagination that way. I think that it opens you up to so much more. And we actually have two questions that sort of tie into that. People are wondering, are there any ideas or words or items or music that inspire you constantly? You know, it's something that you can turn to that will always give you either inspiration or at least that feeling of, you know, an idea is coming down the pipeline. You know, what are some of those pieces that you turn to for inspiration?
I love that question. And for me, it probably sounds crazy, especially given that peacock just shouting. For me, it's birdsong. If I have the writing practice, I guess that I would say that I have is that I am very, very attentive to birdsong, except that.
Good timing.
Especially in the morning. For me, it is like an altered state of consciousness, listening to what birds have to say. And I can imagine that for other people, that will take the form of a piece of music that brings you into that kind of altered state of being able to see it multiple layers all the time. For me, I love music, but it is not. It's not a doorway for me in that way, the way that birdsong is. But that's the beauty of writing, and that's why everybody shines differently, because we have different ways to tap into that imagination.
Yeah. So we're just about here at our time, and I kind of with the thought of imagination in mind, I want to leave us maybe with a little prompt or an idea coming from you that maybe tonight, you know, we've got a couple hours before bedtime, something for us all to take away, an idea for free writing, perhaps, a prompt for us to go back to our pens and papers and write. If you could give us a one sentence prompt or an idea, a spark of imagination, what would you leave us with tonight?
Yeah, I'm eager to think about the things that you are writing. College essays, your own creative work, that term paper that's due next week. One of the things that in writing workshop I love to do is to challenge writers to say, no matter what you're writing on, add a non-human character to your work. Be it a college essay, whatever it is, add the voice of a tree to it, or a bird, or a bullfrog, or a river, and the act of needing to incorporate that being, not as landscape, not as background, not as setting. That's not what I'm talking about, but as a character. Almost always brings really new insights. So give it a try.
I love that. Yes. And for maybe any of the most ambitious, we'll put the peacocks into your story tonight, into whatever you're writing. I love that.
Right.
Oh, well, thank you so much for joining us tonight. This was fantastic. Everyone that's here tonight, thank you for coming. We will have a recording of this available here in a couple of days, so you can look back over these beautiful moments of wisdom from Dr. Kimmerer tonight, and keep that creative spark flowing, and all of our imaginations together. So thank you, Dr. Kimmerer. I don't know if you have any last words for the group, anything you'd like to say before we sign off.
Just gratitude for the opportunity to be together, to think together.
Yes, thank you. Thank you all, everybody. Have a wonderful evening. If you want to turn in your prompts, feel free to send them our way to NWS. Maybe they can end up on our social media in some fun way. And Dr. Kimmerer, we look forward to seeing you back again June 10th, virtually once more, for the National Writers Series author event. So thank you to everyone, and good night.
See you then. Good night.